Welcome, everybody, to the Caregiving Club Newscast. I am your host, Sherri. I'm a corporate gerontologist, author, and CEO of the Caregiving Club. And we're still in season 1 of our premiere newscast, but we're now on episode 9, which is our second episode in June, which I promised you last week. So we've got a lot to share with you. And mostly what we're going to do in this particular episode is we're going to focus on Employee Wellness Month, which is something we do acknowledge and observe and celebrate in June. And so for Caregiver Wellness News, we're going to be looking at a couple of different things. First of all, we are looking at how me time improves both physical and mental health. That's a no-brainer for me because my whole book, Me Time Monday, was based on that. But there has been some additional research that's come out since I published the book. It just continues to reaffirm that getting even a few minutes of self-care, me time can be really beneficial, particularly if you're juggling, work and a job and maybe kids at home and also older loved ones. We're also going to look at a new survey on the sandwich generation, particularly how women are negatively impacted and they're really hitting that burnout wall. So we're going to share some things about that. And then here's an interesting one. Another survey was done on research study was done on why caregiving makes menopause worse. I mean, come on, can't we get a break? Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then in Well Home Design, we're going to kind of do a short version because we want to get mostly into the workplace segment of this episode. But for Well Home Design, because it is still June, Alzheimer's Brain Health Awareness Month, we found a New York Times article, which is really interesting, and it does relate to also working and caregivers in the workplace, but it was how work from home may not be good for you. And we're going to explain that. And we're going to explain the flex work options for caregivers and all that. But it's a really interesting study, and it was very comprehensive because it was done over 15 years of research. So it's one of those, the methodology is really solid. And then we're going to go, as I said, we're going to focus mostly on this caregiving in the workplace segment. So what I've got for you is because it's June Employee Wellness Month, I'm going to share with you some tips. I recently did a really great webinar that was done for HR executives mostly, but I wanted to share those tips with you because I think there's something that's really important for us all to think about, particularly if you are working to maybe observe or take notice or have conversations around whether your workplace offers these types of things or has this kind of culture around caregivers. And then we are going to look at a really great Glassdoor rankings. And this was done by employees who have gone on to Glassdoor, and they ranked the companies that are most supportive of family caregivers. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about an interesting article that was written that said caregiver stigma in the workplace can actually be an opportunity for employers to start addressing how do you overcome this? Again, how do you become more of a caring culture company? So we talk about that. And then finally, a Fast Company article on why women are being pushed out of the workplace based on caregiving. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, going to get to our really popular pop culture segment. And I am going to talk about the joy of sports and the social health of tribes. And that's your little note. And it has something to do with FIFA. So stick with us through that pop culture segment. I also want to remind everybody out there, again, thank you to all of our wonderful subscribers. We're so delighted that you have joined us and stick with us. And we promise to keep bringing these great newscasts to you. But for those of you out there who haven't subscribed yet, don't forget, go to our YouTube channel, hit the subscription button, and not only are you going to get the alerts on this newscast when it drops, but you'll also get the alerts on when we have a new podcast that we put up on our YouTube channel, whether we have, new self-care in 7 minutes videos, whether we have some new webinars that are free and on demand for you. We have all kinds of really great content on that YouTube channel, and we would love for you to subscribe and keep us going so we're able to continue to bring all this great stuff to you. And now let's take a look at Caregiver Wellness News. Caregiver wellness news, we're going to first take a look at me time. As I mentioned earlier, me time was the entire theme of my second book, Me Time Monday. But it talked a lot about neuroscience and best practices and kind of 7 different elements of your life, how to find that balance, how to find that joy. That's really what the book was all about. But there's been, since I published in, my goodness, 2023, I can't believe it was 3 years ago. And of course, I did all the research 2 years prior to that. So since then, there's been, numerous more studies based on self-care and me time. And there was one recently that came that was published. And I thought it was really interesting because it is true that a lot of studies out there about, if you become a caregiver and you're overwhelmed, and of course, you're probably dropping your me time activities because you just don't have time, you're taking care of everybody else. It's all focused on the negative. It's like how your health declines, how your mental health declines, how you're socially isolated, maybe you have, you're more frustrated, or you're prone to angry outbursts or headaches or backaches, or, all of the things that we think about both physically and mentally that can impair you when you're overstressed, when your life is essentially out of balance. But what this particular survey or study did, I'm sorry, I keep calling surveys are where, by the way, surveys are where you take a cohort of people and you ask them some questions. Research is really a lot more in depth, usually includes, focus groups as well as observational, sometimes look at people's lives and habits and behaviors and attitudes and all those kinds of things. So sorry that I keep messing that up. This is actually a study. This was a research study. And what they looked at is, how much me time, and they say always, every study says at the end, but we have to do more research to, prove some of these hypotheses. But it did say that it doesn't really take that long. Now, in my book, I write 7 minutes or less. I do my how to find self-care in 7 minutes or less videos on our YouTube channel. So you can check those out on a wide variety of really great tips from the book. But it said it's really more about the quality, not the quantity. So it's not the time you spend, it's what you're doing. And the other thing that they took a look at, and I'm starting to see this also pop up in the workplace as maybe even a potential covered health benefit, but it's taking a test on your cortisol levels. So we know that when we get up in the morning, our cortisol levels are typically high, probably at the highest. Then they regulate out as we start our day. Now, if we are, under attack from a boss or a coworker or a friend or family member, whatever it happens to be, that's going to spark your stress. That's going to release that cortisol hormone into your system. So, you can see where there might be spikes during the day based on how you're responding to the external attacks that are coming at you. They don't have to be vicious attacks. They can be small references or comments that can, really create that cortisol release. But what they did in this study is that they said that a steeper decline is generally considered a sign of healthier recovery from stress. So if you start out high in the morning with cortisol and then you plummet, that's actually good. That's what your body should be doing, because that's, again, it's bringing you back into balance, or what we call homeostasis. But when they start to see little spikes, during the day is where there is a concern, because it should be a mostly flat pattern of that cortisol. And this is where we can start to identify burnout. If you've got a lot of little spikes on your chart from that cortisol test that you take, and it's they're really simple, they're not invasive. I think they're similar to like a DNA swab almost. But you could start to identify, okay, I didn't even realize I was in chronic stress, or that I'm really facing severe burnout. So it could be interesting. You may want to check it out. I know you can do these tests on your own, but as I said, I've started to see some employers who might be looking to cover that even as an employee benefit, because it helps them also identify when employees, feel out of balance and where they may need some interventions. Maybe they need some help. Maybe they need to be connected to an EAP and some mental health, meditations or whatever it is. But remember, again, quality over quantity, because you can do just a couple minutes to reset yourself. In fact, there's a lot of talk. We've talked on this on my podcast and also on this newscast before about the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in your body. It starts at the bottom of your neck and it travels all the way down your spine to the bottom of your spine, basically. And it is part of the autonomic nervous system. So we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is mostly calm, our rest and digest kind of posture. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the one that gets spiked if we're stressed out. So when you do a breathing exercise, like my favorite is the 4-7-8, you breathe in for 4, hold it for 7, breathe out for 8. You do that 3 times, it will help reset your vagus nerve. It'll help impact that parasympathetic nervous system to go back into calm. So something as simple as just those couple of minutes to do that breathing exercise can help. So that's why I say it doesn't have to be 40 minutes of doing some kind of workout or something else. You just have to kind of get yourself back into that balance. Now, in my book, and by the way, the researchers called this meaningful leisure. So again, not something you have to do for great quantities of time. It just has to be meaningful to you. Now, in my book, I wrote about Niksen, which is Niksen. It's a Dutch cultural experience about you just do nothing. You just kind of lie there, maybe looking out a window, maybe listening to music, but really you don't even need any of that. You just kind of close your eyes. You don't take a little nap. It's almost like a meditation. But you just do that for a few minutes and don't let your mind do the monkey mind or the popcorn brain where it's bouncing around thinking of all kinds of different things. Just try to focus on something. I always love, because it helps with anxiety, the floating exercise from Claire Weeks. One part of that is just imagining yourself like floating down, a lake or a river in a inner tube. That's my everybody else has something personal, but think of something with water, because water is usually pretty soothing to our brain. But Niksen is something you do in solitude. Now, the other thing I wrote about my book was hygge, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. My Danish friends always say, close. So hygge, Hygge, is actually more of a social digital detox. It's where you might play an old-fashioned board game, maybe you're reading a book, but it's a cozy environment. I say warm because this is from Denmark, where it is cold a lot. But during the summer months, it could be something near like a river outside near the coastal waters or lakes or whatever. But it's something that gets you just kind of back in touch with quiet and a little bit more of being with nature, although it doesn't always have to be, but you can do it socially, whereas the Niksen from the Dutch is more solitude. But both of those fit for whatever your needs are at the time, and you can use those. Now, one other part of this study that I thought was really interesting is that 52% of women found their me time, or their sanctuary, if you will, their few minutes of, okay, it's just about me, in the shower, which I think is great. Again, water is very soothing. It's why it's used in so many spiritual, things that we have in our lives. It is something that really soothes us when we do take a shower or a bath, or even just living near the coast or a lake or a river or whatever. There's something about the water that connects with our ancient brain that really does bring us back into calm. So those are all things to think about. Now, the next thing I wanted to turn to is there was a study done about the sandwich generation. And what they're finding is this is a pretty good one. They assessed over 19,000 people. That's a great big cohort. We'd like to see surveys done on a lot of people, because then we can start to say, okay, this is indicative of the larger population or whatever. Sometimes if it's only 100 people, how can you really say that represents millions of people out there? But this is 19,000 people, pretty good. And what it found is that 64% of working women in the sandwich generation, and again, just that definition is you're caring for children as well as for an older loved one, could be parent, grandparent, in-law, aunt, whomever, are at a breaking point and escalating with negative mental health outcomes. Well, things like burnout. This is just another data point, I think, and a big one, the sandwich generation definitely has a lot of challenges, definitely struggles, I think, with those higher burnout numbers that we typically see. And because also a lot of the sandwich generation are working. It's during your prime working years typically. So it doesn't surprise me to see this, but again, it's just another scientific study that shows us, yes, we've got to figure out how do we find balance. It's an easy thing to say, hard to do. But um, most of them also reported depression and anxiety. Now, burnout is really where you've hit the wall. You're so overwhelmed and so stressed from fight or flight responses that are chronic throughout the day. They never stop, they never end. You never get to rest and digest, which is the balance and homeostasis that we need. So when you have that, you hit burnout. Depression and anxiety are a little different. Depression is actually something that is very tied to serotonin. Now, I call serotonin in my book one of the happiness hormones because when you can boost your serotonin levels, it will give you a mood boost. A lot of people who have mental health issues have very, very low serotonin levels, which actually start in the gut. And there's a very strong connection between the microbiome and the good gut bacteria that we need and the nutrition and other things that we're doing with probiotics and prebiotics and our brains. And so, I'll have a link to some of our podcasts, but my favorite one is Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, who wrote The Better Brain. And she really explains this connection so well and really makes us understand that we don't need to turn to polypharmacy. We don't need to have people on multiple medications. There's a lot of people that could be treated just simply with a micronutrient-based diet that helps boost that serotonin. But that depression is a little different. It is more about mood. Um, it can lead sometimes to suicidal ideation, but it is different from stress, which is something that, as I said, it's fight or flight. Depression is more about how we feel about life. It's about hopelessness, not stress, right? It's that kind of an emotion or a feeling. Anxiety is anticipatory stress. So anxiety is where we know the other shoe's going to drop, and we're just waiting for it, or we know that little text reminder that you just got is about something bad or an emergency or something else. So we're in this constant, I'm prepared to fight or flight. So you're either overwhelmed because you're constantly having something disrupt your day and you are in fight or flight, or you're anticipating something disrupting your day. So you're in that fight or that anticipatory stress. So all of these things are working, of course, with our brains. There are ways for us to work through it. But I bring it up because a lot of people, they just throw everything into the same bucket: stress, burnout, depression, anxiety. And from a mental health perspective, they are different. And then that means that there also are different methods to help. For someone who has depression, doing the 4-7-8 breathing exercise, of course, is helpful for everybody. I mean, you could do it at any point. It's going to give you a little bit more calm and more soothing, but it's not necessarily going to help your depression. There are other things that we do to address that. So it's just really important, I think, for us to understand the differences in these types of things. And so anyway, and then the last thing that I came across in Caregiver Wellness News, now, this is mostly for women, although it can affect the men in our lives, but it was a study that was done actually at the Mayo Clinic, and it was the first of its kind study, so that's interesting. And it found that women managing both family caregiving and menopause face nearly double the risk of moderate to severe menopause symptoms like hot flashes, like brain fog, like irritability, like fatigue, including psychological and physical symptoms that often go either unrecognized or untreated. So double whammy to us female family caregivers, because we're spending a lot of time and maybe not getting the me time that we need because we're caring for our loved one. On top of that, if you're going through menopause, your menopause symptoms will be worse. The news just Can't get better, right? Anyway, not to be a Debbie Downer, but there are a lot of things that are being done now to address menopause. We're talking about it more. There's certainly a lot more therapeutics out there. And one thing that's really interesting is that because menopause does have to do with brain, and another example of something that happens mostly to women in the brain is our migraines. More women than men get migraines. There is now this movement towards really um, going on a broader basis into women's health, and particularly for employers. It's very, very hard for employers because you can't really find these one size fits all benefits or programs, and yet you can't do everything, right? But to keep women in the workforce, we're going to talk about that in a minute. A lot of employers are turning to, okay, we now know women's health is broader, and we know caregiving is a big part of that. And obviously, we're seeing these connections like caregiving and menopause symptoms, caregiving and migraines. So now we need to kind of consider caregiving as part of that overall women's health initiative. Doesn't mean that it isn't part of also men's health, because we know a lot of men, about 40%, are family caregivers. But it just brings up that women seem to suffer more physically and mentally from family caregiving. And one of the reasons why is because men, um, you know, are not natural nurturers. Women are, and that's okay. Men are natural solution problem solvers. And what they do is they hire professional caregivers to help them out. More men than women. Mostly women will take on the task themselves. They'll care for the loved one themselves. Um, and so that's where we see the burnout, whereas men will hire a professional to come into the home. Or maybe, they've made the decision with the family to move a loved one to memory care or whatever it is. But they don't have that ongoing, constant emotional and physical strain of daily hands-on caregiving. So anyway, with that, we're going to go into our Well Home Design news. Hey, so for Well Home Design News, this is a pretty short segment because we want to get to the workplace, caregiving in the workplace stuff that we have for you today. But I did want to share just a couple quick things. So, as I mentioned, I think in the last newscast, I was recently at a conference up in Northern California, and I made some presentations on NeuroDesign, which is really the new evolution, if you will, in how we're designing our homes, how we're designing senior living, um, how we should be designing our offices, and many, many companies and corporations and building designers have certainly embraced this. It's not necessarily new, but it incorporates something called biophilic design, which is basically a love of nature. And it's all about bringing, nature inside, or at least being able to have views to nature outside and experience the greenery, the blue skies, the fresh air, the circadian rhythm lighting, the more natural elements of wood, and things that, again, are soothing to our brains and help, with that kind of parasympathetic nervous system to keep us calmer on our vagus nerve, and to be able to feel calm and safe and soothed in our environment. So anyway, this is the new evolution of what's happening. And it's really, for me, it's very validating, I do have to say, because as I mentioned earlier, when I wrote my Me Time Monday book, I actually started my research 6 years ago. And usually my books take a couple of years or so to research, just because I can't do it full time. I'm also working and doing these newscasts and podcasts and consulting for companies and other things. But it takes about 2 years. And then it takes me about maybe a year to write it again, just trying to get as much time in as possible. And that means full edits and all of that to get it basically to the publisher and print it out. But 6 years ago is when I started doing this research, and it was really at the tipping point of where we were starting to see restaurants and hotels and even corporate office buildings move this way. So now, as I speak about it, it's like, well, yeah, of course, because you see it everywhere. I mean, I see it everywhere. And I always try to take pictures. In fact, it was really funny because as I was coming back from this conference, I was up in Berkeley. So I flew in and out of the Oakland airport, and Kaiser Permanente, interestingly enough, because I'm going to mention Kaiser in the next segment, but Kaiser Permanente had a big, huge sign across all of the before you go to the TSA check-in, and it was on the wall, and it was it was a living, I think it was a living wall. It may have been fake plants, but they were beautiful greenery, and then the Kaiser Permanente logo was in white embedded in this greenery. So there you go. Even in the stressful airports where you're going to go through TSA, we're going to give you a little biophilic design to hopefully calm you down. No, but it is exciting to see it, and so I feel validated. I feel like, oh wow, I did tap into a trend that really did become something big, and will become even bigger over the next decade. Because now it's starting to seep into again our home interior designs, our office designs, and everything else, and senior living is in to this whole. They're calling it a little bit more wellness, but it really is pathway towards that neurodesign and biophilic design. So anyway, and my third book, by the way, is called The Snug Home, and it's going to be all about this. So it won't be necessarily at the tipping point of this evolution, but I think and hope it will be a great primer on how you can do it yourself at home, what you should think about. And yes, hopefully my research will uncover some things that'll be even more future forward for you in that book. The other thing I wanted to mention in our Well Home Design is this is actually kind of funny. It was in the New York Times. It was an article, and it's how older women are starting to take a cue from that I think it was 1980s, 19 maybe late 1970s, early 80s, whatever. TV show called The Golden Girls. Many of us, I'm sure, have seen this, even if it's been on Hulu or Netflix or other, reruns or whatever, or streaming services. But it was a really great comedy of four older women who came together to become roommates in one home. And one of the women had her older mother living with her. So we had a caregiving situation, but it was hilarious. It was another Norman Lear spectacular. He was just such a I don't know. He was an icon. I am so blessed that I got the chance to meet him and know him and do a little bit of work with him. But anyway, that was one of his great shows. So what this article is all about is how older women of today who find themselves either, widowed or divorced or just solo agers who didn't have any children, are starting to make these plans. Now, the reason I'm laughing is because probably a decade ago, I'm sure it was 10 years ago because time flies. I have this group of girlfriends who we're all the same age. And by the way, all their names, just so they know who they are as they're listening to this, start with an M. So Molly, Merritt, Michelle, you know who you are. Anyway, we always get together for lunch and, do the girl thing, right? And so anyway, we had talked about a decade ago about this is going to be our plan because two of us are unmarried without children. One person did have children, but they had kind of moved away, and then the fourth was married but no children. And so we're like, okay, so we're going to find ourselves maybe, solo agers. At least two of us are right now. We're going to live together. Where are we going to live? How's it going to look? Anyway, it was kind of a fun conversation. Quite frankly, people are now getting serious about it. So there are some home sharing, roommate matching services out there. And we're going to have a list of them for you. Some of them are more regional or local, but from a national standpoint, there's the National Shared Housing Resource Center. So that's a really great resource. But I also want to do a shout out to a podcast interview we did with Savinia Falquest. So that was season 5, episode 58. We're going to have a link on our newscast page. But Savinia is one of the owners of HomeShare. Now, she operates in Oregon. It is a franchise kind of situation. But HomeShare is a service, again, where they match up mostly older adults with older adults. Now, there are other services that will match you up with maybe like a college student. So if you live in a college town and you want somebody who is a little bit younger, who can open the jars and has a little bit more energy to do certain things, maybe around the house, and then they get a discount on their rent because they don't have much money as they're going to college. I've seen those types of services, so we'll have all of those different links for you. But it's an interesting trend because as we all live longer, we're having to, reframe, reshape, redesign what our lives are going to look at like and what our living situations are going to be. And just some food for thought. And Molly, Merritt, Michelle, I'm ready to make our solid plans. So now let's go to our big focus, which is June Employee Wellness Month, and it's caregiving in the workplace. For our caregiving in the workplace, as I said at the beginning of this episode, we were going to do a whole lot on this because it is June Employee Wellness Month, and there has been a lot of surveys, studies, activities, different things going on out there. We want to try to capture as much as we could because this is such a growing and important area, particularly for those employees who are also caregiving for a family member. So let me start off with, I was actually very honored and privileged to be invited to be a panelist on a webinar that was recently done by the National Conflict Resolution Center. And they work with employers to, overcome certain conflicts in the workplace based on a variety of different issues. They also help HR departments stay in compliance, both legally and otherwise. Anyway, it's a really great organization. And they reached out and said, hey, we really want to focus on caregiving in the workplace. We feel like this is an area and a topic we don't cover enough. We've had a couple of requests from some HR executives that are clients, and could you be part of that? So, of course, I was very honored to do that. And I'll tell you at the end who my fellow panelist was, because it was just the two of us doing this. But what I wanted to share with you are just some tips that I brought out in that webinar. Also, the link in case you're interested in watching it. They did put it up on their YouTube channel, which is public, so anybody can watch it, even though it was really designed to speak mostly to those HR executives. So first of all, a couple of sound bites, if you will, that I've been using a lot because I do so much work in this space with employers is employers are care aware. They are. They understand there's, caregiving situations happening all over America. They understand it's a wide and growing group. So they're care aware, and they may or may not know the statistics, like 63 million Americans are unpaid family caregivers right now. 1 in 5 in the workplace who are employees are caring for an adult over 18, and 1 in 3 are caring for children or older adults. So everything from childcare to senior care. They may not know that specifically, but I'm sure they're feeling it because, these are just the disruptions that are going on in the workplace. So care aware. So what I talk about is, how do you go from being a care aware company or organization to a caring culture organization? And so I went through, like I think it was 4 tips that I had, but certainly the first is just simply recognizing caregiving in your workplace, understanding and normalizing caregiving so that it doesn't have a stigma around it, so that caregivers do feel free to come to supervisors and managers or HR departments and say, listen, I'm really struggling. I need some help. And in my book, Me Time Monday, I wrote about this group of employees, and I called them Gen C, Generation Caregiver. Now, that terminology, by the way, I use for everybody who's a caregiver. You don't have to be working to be part of Gen C. I used it because it isn't based on what we call demographics, meaning your age, different things like where you live or what you do. Gen C is what we call psychographics. And psychographics are based on a group of people who have certain attitudes, needs, beliefs. It's based mostly on that type of group. And that's what caregiving is. Now, I want to recognize that there is no one size fits all for caregiving. We know that every single caregiving situation is unique to the people involved. But there are some commonalities. There are some foundational things that employers can look at that would be helpful to every single caregiver out there, no matter what their situation. And that also, by the way, can include childcare, or if you're caring for a child, for instance, who may be neurodivergent or whatever. But it's normalizing caregiving in the workplace, making it an open conversation, making people feel comforted that they're not going to be stigmatized, that they're not going to be seen as less productive, because we see in all the studies, right? Oh, caregiving employees, they're less productive, they're more stressed, they're going to have higher health costs. Yuck. I mean, come on, people. When you have this many people caregiving in the workplace, yeah, we can't take that attitude. And the studies, unfortunately, tend to focus on the negative. Like I talked about in the segment on caregiver wellness, it's like, what about the positives? And by the way, shout out to Rutgers University, who recently did some fantastic research. I think I may have mentioned it last time, so I hate to repeat myself, but they did fantastic research showing that caregivers build certain skills that are essential in the workplace. Things like empathy, things like emotional intelligence, things like collaborative work, multitasking, great time management, flexibility when faced with, challenges. I could go on and on. It was a list of about 18 different things that caregivers are learning being a caregiver that are skills. It's upskilling that you bring back into the workplace. So we can flip that script, folks. We can flip the script on caregivers in the workplace and say there are a lot of positives that can be done. Also, caregivers who have experienced caregiving can become mentors for other caregivers, particularly younger caregivers, because we see the younger caregivers who are in the younger millennial or even Gen Z cohorts, they suffer more from a lot of negative mental health impact from caregiving, more so than their older counterparts. So there could be mentorship type programs. There's all kinds of stuff. But one of the things I talked about with care navigation, because one of the things caregivers need, they don't, you can still do your own research because you do want to know about the disease, or you want to know about certain things that you might need to understand. However, you don't need to spend hours and hours and hours searching for the right wheelchair, or for, other medical durable goods, or for techniques on this or that or whatever. You can have an expert guide you, help you find it, give you peace of mind. Okay, this really is the best choice, or the most affordable choice, or my loved one's a veteran, and so he or she qualifies for this. That is where these care navigation experts come in, and that's invaluable in my mind. And that fits everybody because, again, the needs will all be different. They will change over time because, let's face it, caregiving is a marathon, not a sprint. The average time people spend in their caregiving role is 4.5 years. And if you're caring for someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, it's 9 years. It's double. So this is a long journey. Things change along that journey. You have now different needs as maybe the disease like Alzheimer's progresses, and you need that expert help, that navigation. The other thing I think that employers can start looking at, and I'm only going to do 2 of these. I went into a whole list of things, but is really integrating your caregiving benefits. So let's say you do have care navigation, or let's say you do have flex time, or something else. But integrate this with your corporate wellness programs, because across the board, we spend over $68 billion a year on corporate wellness programs meant for all employees, right? But let's face it, some of those benefits may not help caregivers because they don't have the time. If you're offering a free yoga class after work, that's fabulous. I actually experienced that with one of my employers and I loved it. But if I'm caregiving, I've got to run home. I can't take a yoga class, right? I don't have that kind of time affluence, if you will, to do those types of things. Okay, so how do we make these things work for caregivers? It's a little bit of creativity. You got to dig down, but I think we do need to take a look sometimes at this subset of employees and say, okay, this probably isn't going to work for them. So what can we do that would work for them? And I do a shout out to care.com because they were brilliant in working with Headspace recently, the mental health app. And they came up with meditations that were 3 minutes or less, that were specifically for caregivers. And not only does that acknowledge that you're a caregiver and this is a special role and we're here to support you, but also it was taking into consideration we know you don't have any time. So we're going to keep these to 3 minutes and you can do them at your desk, or you can walk outside and sit, under a beautiful tree, or maybe at home, when you get up or before you go to bed. Anyway, it was very thoughtful. And I think those are the types of things we need. So, the other thing that we talked about was burnout for women, where work and care are blended into one identity. Well, that's the tough part, right? Many of us who are caregivers, I mean, I talked to this one woman who had a very high level job at a big financial services company. And she said, my day starts at 4 a.m. I work 4 hours as a caregiver, taking care of my mom who lives with us and getting my kids ready for school and getting me ready for work. I get to work by 8:30. Then I start my quote unquote 9 to 5 job, executive job, which is never 9 to 5. I do work all day. Sometimes, yeah, there will be a disruption because I've got to, pick up mom and take her to the doctor or whatever. So I've got that. So that means then I've got to bring work home and do a little bit of work at home. And then I get home and now I'm into, again, my second job, which is caregiving again, getting everybody fed and bathed and ready for bed and making sure they're okay, and then getting to some of my work and starting it all over again. What your colleagues don't see at work is the 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. and the, 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. to midnight or whatever it is that you're spending doing all that caregiving. And that's where I say we have to normalize caregiving. It is part of many people's lives. We have to recognize it. We have to be at least sympathetic, if not empathetic about it. But this is, a lot of particularly women who do hands-on caregiving more than men who are caregivers, they're never switched off. They never get that off switch. That's what Me Time Monday is all about. 7 minutes of switching off, at least, if you could do that once a day would be great. And this is where respite breaks are vital. So again, I think that employers need to look at, do you offer backup emergency services? Do you offer any paid respite? Or at the very least, can you make certain accommodations so that caregivers have a little bit more flexibility than those who aren't caregiving? And education being a big one, that's probably more self-interested because that's a big piece of what I do for employers. I do webinars, I do workshops, I do trainings for executives, but it's all about educating them about aging, about longevity, and certainly about caregiving and the sensitivities of it and what we need to think about and all of these other things. And then basically the bottom line is this. The goal for employers is you can't solve it all. Again, caregiving is no one size fits all. There are some common things you can do that I think are reasonable because you do want to try to keep those employees in the workplace. They are valuable to you because many of them are your more middle to senior managers. And you just, want to kind of make an understanding within the workplace that, listen, we know you come to work and you work for us and you're focused on our success. And we all win when that happens. But we also recognize you do have a life outside of these walls, and that sometimes impacts your work here. And we want to try to help you find the best balance that we can. And I think what that means is the goal for employers is to alleviate stress and amplify support, right? So alleviate stress, amplify support. That's what I talked about. Anyway, I met a really great new friend and colleague on this webinar, this panel, and it was Melissa Fisher of Kaiser Permanente. And we got along so well. We were so simpatico. I had her on the podcast. So you can check out our conversation where Melissa talks about working at Kaiser Permanente, which is her employer, and what support she got and is getting as a caregiver. That is our most recent podcast episode that dropped. It's season 6, episode 72. We're going to have a link. But Melissa, really great insights and really speaking very specifically to best practice, which is Kaiser Permanente. Now, let's move to our second story in this area of caregiving in the workplace. I mentioned earlier a survey, or I'm sorry, a study, research study, and a big one that was done. And it was published in Science magazine. For those of you out there who aren't as familiar with research, particularly in the healthcare area, the New England Journal of Medicine, Science, PLOS, PLOS, I'm trying to think of any of there's about 5 scientific peer-reviewed journals out there, science being one of them. It's really hard to get published in. It's really hard to get your research in there. And it's a very rigorous, you know, um, pathway to get that published. So when I see something published in one of those publications, I know how tough it is, and I know how good the research probably was because, they just don't let everybody in, I guess. So this was published in Science, and this was also written up by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and I think it even hit a lot of the TV news, for a quick soundbite. But it was all about how remote work promotes isolation and decreases our mental health. Okay, wow. So here's the deal. During, of course, the pandemic, we all, for the most part, work from home. I work from home just in general because I'm a solopreneur. I don't have a lot of employees. I have vendors and partners I work with, but I don't have that type of a company. It's kind of all me, right? I'm a consultant, and then also I do this content. I do education around content, and that's either done in person or virtually. Um, and I'm able to do that from home, and I'm grateful for that. But I could relate to some of the stuff in this study because when you do that, you are a bit isolated, particularly the work I do because things have to be quiet. It's not like I can, take a phone call while I'm doing a webinar for 9,000 employees of a certain employer client or something, right? And so you get a little bit isolated. So you really have to you have to build those social health muscles and be a planner and reach out to friends. Don't just slip into the shadows, but you have to be proactive. And sometimes I find myself like, oh, wow, I haven't talked to a couple of my friends in maybe a week or more. And that's frightening, right? Because I have other social stimulation, so don't worry about me. But you just have to be planful and you have to make sure that's happening. Well, when you're a harried, let's say, sandwich generation caregiver, and you got the kids at home, again, this is during the pandemic, and they're trying to do e-learning, and then you're taking care of parents and you're concerned about them and their health and issues, and maybe not having somebody come into the home like you used to, like a home care worker, and so now you're doing it. I mean, we can see where this is going, right? It's just spiraling down, 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 down. Now, I will say this. I do think that for caregivers, again, there's no one size fits all for employers. So you have to be flexible. You have to I know you have to make policies that affect everybody. I know that's the tough part. That's the big challenge. I really do feel for employers because it's very hard to do that and have everybody be happy and everybody feel supported, right? But if you had flex time, that would allow caregiving employees to come in a little late, maybe leave a little early, maybe take a longer lunch hour, and be able to perform some of their caregiving duties during the day. If you have certain benefits like backup care and there's an emergency, I've heard again and again and again that the employees who have that from their employers, they're just so grateful. But not every employer can do that, right? Small companies would struggle with something like that. So anyway, as employers are challenged with all this, we have to think about a lot of employees. In fact, let me just tell you this here. 35 million people right now today work from home, okay? In 2024, which is right kind of as the pandemic was closing out, thankfully, nearly 80% of workers said they would be happiest if they could continue to work remotely. And again, I have some colleagues who have expressed that. Now, most companies have called their employees back to work at least a few days a week, if not for the full week. And a lot of people are like, because you kind of get in a rut. You get used to the remote work. You don't have to maybe put on makeup. You don't even have to get out of your jammies. You're just right there. But after a while, that can really also start to wear on you because you're not getting into social mode. You're not taking care of yourself as well, really. You're letting certain things go. And it's really important to keep those things up, even if you're not caregiving. So I guess I'm trying to come around to this conversation where I understand the work from home requests from caregivers, because it certainly can be a lot easier, particularly if you've got to make a commute back and forth and where your loved one lives is not close to your work. So I know that that can be tough. However, we should also sit down with these employees and say, look, we recognize that this could make you feel isolated, not make you feel part of the team, not have the interactions, that are making you feel good. That, hey, we had a big win today. Let's all celebrate. Well, if you're at home, you can't really have that. You don't get that oxytocin. I talk about oxytocin as one of the happiness hormones. You don't get oxytocin from sitting at home and working from home. You get oxytocin from being in real life next to people, looking into their eyes, hugging them, shaking their hand, whatever it is, right? Celebrating. So we have to have those conversations. And again, it's a supervisor's job. And this is why I say training is so key. I would say if employers do one thing, please, please, please increase your training around caregiving employees in the workplace for your middle managers, and also, quite frankly, for your senior leadership, because your senior leadership in the C-suite have to support this. So they have to know what it feels like, what's going on. And you can always call me. I can help you. That's my little plug. But I do think that it's an interesting story. And what this Science Magazine research found is that they looked at 500,000 employees, huge cohort. Oh my gosh, that's huge. Over 15 years. So it was a longitudinal data that they were analyzing. And they saw a 20% decrease in mental well-being for those employees who work from home. Okay, 20% can be significant. And so anyway, we need social interaction. You need a variety, whether it's just seeing the barista every morning at your favorite coffee shop, whether it's going to the grocery store instead of having your groceries delivered, even though you would see the delivery person. Getting out there and doing things in person sounds retro, but it's so vital. It's vital to our social health and our overall physical and mental well-being. The other thing is, as I mentioned, no oxytocin. If you're not seeing people on a daily basis, you're getting no oxytocin. Now, you need that to survive, by the way. That's our love, trust, bonding hormone, but it also makes us know we're not alone. When you're alone, you can't survive. And that's the ancient brain. We're kicking into the stress of the ancient brain that was out on the African savannah 2 to 3 million years ago. And if you're left alone out there, you're probably not going to make it. You got to be with the tribe. You got to be with your people to be able to survive, right? So that's where the social health kicks in for our neuroscience piece of this, our brain health. And, again, as I said, you're not celebrating with colleagues or having coffee or sharing an intimacy with, a coworker, whatever it is. You're not doing that bonding. You're not learning new things. So all of those things that are so helpful, that are part of our work life, should be considered when we're thinking about remote work and all of that. So anyway, moving on to the next story I've got for you. It's got quite a bit. Oh, yeah, let's get to this. This is really good. So Glassdoor, by the way, I've been trying to keep up with the Milken Institute, U.S. News and World Report, and the Society for HR Management. All three of those organizations said, oh, we've got this great rankings of the best companies who support family caregivers in the workplace. That was published last year. So I'm waited with bated breath for the 2026 rankings. Nada, nothing. Nobody will return my call, which is really bad. I might have to call that person out that I've been trying to connect with. But anyway, I don't know what's going to happen with that. It was exciting to see that they were focused on it. But here's another one. Glassdoor, okay, which is the place that you go to make comments about your employment, good and bad, so that other employees can see, is this a place I'd really maybe want to work? And then, of course, you can search for jobs. They did a best places to work survey for family caregivers among 10,000 employees who had joined their site. So they went into Glassdoor and created an account. They queried those employees. I'm sorry, those employees of 10,000 companies. Okay. So it wasn't 10,000 employees, it was 10,000 companies, I guess. Yeah, that was the data. Okay, that's interesting. Anyway, here's what they found. We have the list. We're going to have it on our episode guide page, or our newscast page. But number one, okay, this is interesting. Google got the number one rating. Okay, Google, thumbs up for family caregivers. Now, who was behind Google just by a couple of teeny points? They all tied, and here are those companies: the U.S. Air Force, go military. We love our military and our vets. McKinsey and Company, okay, and Cisco they all tied for a rating right below Google. Anyway, and then it goes on with some other ones. Mostly these are larger companies, so obviously the smaller mid-size companies weren't necessarily ranked, although 10,000 companies you would think they would be. I don't have any more data on that. That was all that they shared with us, but that just tells you that it is something that organizations like Glassdoor, U.S. News World Report, SHRM, Milken Institute, a lot of these organizations are starting to look at, how do employers treat their employees who are caregiving in the workplace? So it's something for employers to just keep top of mind, and for employees to know about too, that you can go search these rankings. Now, there's a company called Sparrow, and they do a platform for leave management for HR companies. So they manage all of the leave requests and, keeping on top of things and all that. Anyway, they did a survey. Now, this was just a survey. And they found, I'm trying to see if we have how many they surveyed. I think it was about 1,000. So it's usually the minimum threshold. But they interviewed employees about, is caregiving a stigma in the workplace? And here's what they found. 8% of employees feel comfortable discussing caregiving with HR. 8%. 92% don't feel comfortable. That's bad. 20% reportedly hide their caregiving lives from their supervisors and bosses and colleagues. And 41% worry about being perceived as unreliable. There you go. Unproductive, whatever. So we really do have to get rid of this stigma. And what Sparrow was emphasizing is, look, if you look at these survey results, this is a great opportunity for companies to recognize we've got to turn these numbers really upside down. We got to get 92% of employees saying they feel comfortable coming and talking to us or talking to their boss or supervisor, right? So it's just interesting. I recently wrote an article, by the way, about the reason why people aren't feeling comfortable is, again, managers and supervisors almost across the board, every company, every organization, every industry aren't doing enough training in this space. And they acknowledge that. I've dug into all the, HR publications and, sat in on other webinars where HR executives are talking, and they acknowledge they haven't done enough training. Training is the only thing that I think really gets us past that stigma, because then we start to, it's not enough to read it in a memo or something and say, don't do this or be supportive. But when you actually go through a training, it's pretty significant. It sticks with many, many people, and we need to do that more. So again, shout out to employers. Please train your managers, and for employees, recognize that. If you know your company trains supervisors on family caregiving, then maybe you should feel a little bit more okay about opening up to them and, sharing what your challenges are and how they can help you. Then there was an article in Fast Company, and this is our last article for this segment on workplace caregiving. A Fast Company I love, as you know, I've referenced them a couple of times, but this is the headline: Women aren't opting out of work. Workplaces are pushing them out. Woo-hoo. Okay, what's that about? So I'll just read to you. It says, the caregiving strain is quietly reshaping who stays, who leaves, and who advances. Yet most companies still treat it as a private issue or personal issue with an employee instead of a business critical one. That's a really good point, because we have to also look at the lens differently. It isn't about this not problem employee, but this employee who they got issues going on in the family and stuff. That is impacting your bottom line. And that's not the only person who is struggling with caregiving, as you well know from the numbers that have come out of other surveys that have been done. This is across the board going to impact your business. So you really do have to take it seriously. You have to address it, even though this might be the most extreme case or the one that you know about. There's probably 20 employees behind that person that you know nothing about who are going through the same struggle. So you just know what the numbers are. But here's what they said. So this was a survey that was conducted of 690 U.S. employees, split almost evenly between men and women. That's a little low, to be honest with you. I'd like to see those numbers be a little higher, but okay. And while both men and women said caregiving and work is tough, women were more likely than men to report long-term unpaid caregiving responsibilities as becoming a caregiving strain, 83 to 72%. So, more women were saying, oh yeah, this is a strain on everything in my life, including my work, and I need help. So here's something interesting. So maybe those women are leaving the workplace, right? They're making that decision to just be the full-time caregiver for whomever they're caring for in their lives, children, older parents, same generations at the same time, whatever it is. But companies say, well, women they aren't as interested in advancing in their careers, right? That's the assumption. If you make that decision to leave, you've chosen obviously family over career, which is fine. There's no negativity to that. But is that true? Because here's the other stat that this article points out, which I thought was interesting. Women's participation in the same time period as this survey was done, their women's participation in entrepreneurship and self-employment increased. So they weren't stepping away from work. They were stepping into new work that allowed them the flexibility, the opportunity to juggle all the caregiving with career or with a job and maybe even some self-care time. So let's take a look at that, folks, because we're going to assume that, oh, they just don't want to work or can't work. It's just too overwhelming. Are you kidding me? I can tell you what it is to be an entrepreneur. It's not easy. Solopreneurs, it's not an easy job when you're doing it all yourself. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. I think it's something that needs a greater examination by some researchers to take a look at. But they also found that 87% of employees reported higher productivity if they had flexible work arrangements. That's what I just said, right? It's not that, okay, you can work from home indefinitely. It's, yeah, I'm going to recognize your flex time. You know what needs to get done. We have deadlines, we have goals, we have KPIs we have to meet, but I'm going to trust you as the employee. And I'm also going to point you to some things that might help you with your time. Like this could take hours out of your caregiving research. Call these guys or do this or whatever. But this is where now the boss manager becomes the helpmate in making it work at work. You're still going to get your deadlines met. You're still going to have this person feel like they're a productive member of the team. They just have to do it flexibly. They aren't going to get it done by 5 p.m., but they'll get it done by midnight at home or something. I'm not trying to put that burden on people, but what I'm saying is when you have flexibility, there is a little bit of a pause. There's a little bit of a, okay, now it's on me to figure out when can I do all this, or can I get help with a couple things because I've really got to do this thing. So 87% of employees report higher productivity in flexible arrangements. Don't forget that. That's a big one. And also, the same research found that there was higher engagement, lower turnover, and this is what the companies are looking for, 1.7 times faster revenue growth, all tied to these flexible arrangements who recognize and normalize caregiving in the workplace. Okay. That's something really big, right? And so anyway, I think that's a really big one for all of us to think about. And then I just want to do a little correction. I'm so sorry. I did a boo-boo on the last newscast. We were talking about training of family caregivers. And I said the Care Academy does that. Well, unfortunately, I didn't realize that I think it was just recently, like within the last couple months, Care Academy was acquired by a new company. They no longer do family caregiving training. It's only professional direct care worker training for certified nurse assistants, home care workers, you name it. Unfortunately, no more family caregiver training. However, there are some resources. One of them is Caregiving Years Training Academy. So we're going to have a link to that. And there are some other training things through ARP. So just know that there are some resources for you as a family caregiver, but not that Care Academy that I mentioned. So that's my correction for this newscast. Now, let's get into our fun pop culture segment. So, for our culture segment, as many of you know, this is one of our favorite segments. And again, thank you for your emails. Those of you who have emailed and said, we really love some of the things that you cover that, most other caregiving organizations and news don't report out on some of this stuff. So the pop culture is always kind of fun. I will cop to something. I have recognized myself that so often in pop culture, I'm criticizing. I'm criticizing the HGTV shows. I'm criticizing the news anchors out there about ageism and, caregiving comments and some other things. And I don't want to be all critical. I think it's important to point those things out because they're necessary. And we want people to be more educated. And unfortunately, one of the ways we do get educated is through TV shows, through TV news, or other news that we're seeing on social media or online. Although you've heard my rant a little bit about social media, particularly things like TikTok. So often the things that are trendy, like drink this juice and you'll live to 150 or whatever. You just have to be really, really, really careful about those types of things. But anyway, all of that said, this pop culture is going to be totally upbeat, positive, and fun because I'm so thrilled at kind of what I'm experiencing and feeling, and I wanted to share that with you. So, as many of you know, the U.S. has been the home to many of the FIFA, the World Cup soccer, FIFA. Games and championships leading up to who's going to win that trophy. And, this whole soccer phenomenon, unfortunately, I kind of never got into it. I didn't have children, so I didn't, a lot of people get into it because their kids play. I'm more of a football, baseball fan when it comes to watching sports. So I never got into it that way, but it's huge, right? It's a global phenomenon. Many, many, many people in the U.S., love our team and have been really into it. And a lot of people, of course, through the Olympics and other types of games like World Cup soccer, have also gotten really into it for women's sports because the women's teams have done so well, won the championships and all that kind of stuff. But what we're seeing right now is beyond sports, right? And that's the part that has really engaged me. I'm not watching the matches, I'm watching the people who came to see the matches. Because as a gerontologist, I study sociology. And I'm fascinated by this kind of movement that I'm seeing where you've got people who have come from Scotland and Norway and Mexico and every country out there to come watch their team play and hopefully proceed, in these games. But it's really there's really a lot of positivity around it. I mean, let me give you some for instances. If you've missed it, and I don't know how you can because it's all over the news. But for instance, the Norway fans, they do this little thing. It's a ritual where they row like the big Viking longships, They all get together, they sit on the ground and they row together. And it's hilarious, but it's also like, oh my God, how fun, how bonding. And everybody who's seen it, I'm sure we've all felt the same way. You want to just jump into one of the rows and get into the rowing with these guys. But, so that's been wonderful. The other thing is, and, many of you know, I've talked about it before, I have a Scottish heritage. So I'm loving the Scotland fans, not only because they came over here with all their different kilts. Thank you, Tartan Navy or Tartan Army. We love it. Um, but They love our fast food, our grocery stores. They love all the stuff that we take for granted. Air conditioning, they're loving the air conditioning. Anyway, it's pretty interesting to watch all these fan comments about not only being here to support their team, but also being here and really experiencing America. And what a wonderful thing during our 250th anniversary for people to learn more about us and really, like us. Because so often we're told how the rest of the world doesn't like us. Well, I'm not buying it. I always knew there was a little secret out there. But, and the Mexico team, I love that the other night. I watched some of that where they were dancing around and they had sombreros on. I can't remember the player's name, but he's like the hero player on their team, and they all had the sombreros with his name on it. Here's the thing. Again, I'm going to go back to my gerontology roots and sociology. Um, Sporting events are kind of natural places where we gather with our tribe. Now, I went to almost every single football game when I was in college, when I was at USC, and even beyond when I became an alumni. I had season tickets, and it was such a bonding experience, and it was something that, was connected to the fall, which I love that season. But, you might have that experience, or maybe it's your hometown. Even some of these places that have the Cub teams that send them up then to the big leagues. I mean, I think about that one of my favorite movies, Bull Durham, with Kevin Costner and Susan Sarandon, right? Where that was all about that small hometown team, and then you get sent up to the show. But it's a bonding experience for many of us because we're shouting out for our team to win. We commiserate when they don't win, but we got good spirits. We'll get them next time. And it's really fun. And I think that's what we have missed in life. We are not having fun anymore, and part of it is, let me just say, politics has invaded our lives in very bad ways. We have to pay attention and you have to vote intelligently and be educated about all of that. But we cannot let politics invade the things that bring us together, the things that bring us joy, the things that we should be applauding and celebrating. And sporting events are perfect. They're the perfect time to join a tribe, right? You join your little tribe, you join your team or whatever, and you go through the highs and lows with them. I mean, how many of you have gone to some kind of a sporting event, not knowing the people sitting next to you, but the team is winning, you're jumping up and down, you're hugging each other, right? You're becoming best pals, you buy, a beer for the whole row or whatever. It's just a wonderful thing to watch. And I think that we need more of that. And I think we need to encourage our younger people to start getting into things that bring them joy. I am the ambassador and spokesperson for Comfort Keepers for the National Day of Joy, which I love. I love the fact that they focus on that at least once a year to remind us all to do that. So, again, for caregivers, it's hard. You don't have time to go to a football game, soccer game, whatever it is, right? Uh, Also, the cost of tickets, I will say, have gotten a little pricey. So, we need to look at that because this should be for all. This should be something where all can celebrate and come together. There should be the cheap seats. Um, we know there's the VIP boxes, but we also have to think about the people who just get so much out of this from the local community or whatever. But it gives us an opportunity to do that. For caregivers, that's tough. Now you can watch things on television or, stream it or whatever. That's fine. That's great. That's one way to get into it and be part of it. You're cheering even though you're sitting in the hospital or ER waiting room, having just taken mom or dad to, for an emergency or something. But this is also where maybe we need to find the people who can help us take the burden of caregiving for an hour or two while we can go watch a game, or even if you go to half of the game or something, or sit outside and tailgate with friends and don't even go inside because it's too expensive. So you're going to watch it from somebody's RV who has a television or something like that. Anyway, there's some creative, innovative things out there I know that you can do, but it is important because we have to get that oxytocin release I mentioned. Now, I call it a happiness hormone, but it is also a survival hormone. you won't survive without oxytocin release, as well as some of these other happiness hormones like endorphins, which is more like around your physical, jumping up and down and cheering on your team, or the dopamine release of, yeah, we did it, we won, or the serotonin, which is your feel good hormones. Those are all your happiness hormones, and you get all of those when you go to a sporting event. Even if your team doesn't win, you still did some bonding and some other things. And, we need it. We are tribal. I mentioned in the last segment, if you're out on the African savannah 2 to 3 million years ago, which is where we started to evolve as humans, and you're left behind or kicked out of the tribe, like on Survivor, right? You aren't going to survive. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. That is how we are wired as humans, is to be together, to have that social health be a key part of our overall health. And there's been numerous studies. If you're isolated or you're lonely chronically and not engaging, it's like smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of what it's doing to your heart health. We know that you are going to increase your Alzheimer's risk by 40% if you're chronically lonely. So there's a lot of things tied now to our physical health that we now know about our social health. So all of that said, don't overlook your social health. Enjoy your sports. Pick your team. Cheer them on whatever way that you can. Even for caregivers who really don't have a lot of time, find a moment, find something you love and find that moment. And it will help you live longer. And so I say, go, go, go. All these countries, I love Team USA, of course. But I love Team Scotland. I love Team Norway. I love, all these other countries that are doing stuff. It's just fabulous to see you. And thank you so much for bringing your joy to our country and letting us see that we can all come together and find that happiness in certain ways. And that's important because that'll help us all live longer. So thank you. That's a wrap for Caregiving Club Newscast this week. We hope you enjoyed these news segments. You can email us at info@caregivingclub.com to let us know a news story we should cover or leave us a comment on our YouTube page. And don't forget to subscribe to our Caregiving Club YouTube channel to get all the caregiving news every other week, as well as our other content, our Me Time Monday Self-Care in 7 Minutes weekly videos, and our Caregiving Club On Air podcasts, which are available on our Caregiving Club YouTube channel, as well as Apple, Amazon, Spotify, SiriusXM, iHeartRadio, and other podcast listening channels. Find out more about Sherri and Caregiving Club at caregivingclub.com. Take care and stay well.